All right, welcome. We're going to jump right in with a puzzle that, honestly, gets to the very heart of how we read any ancient text. It's this fascinating literary mystery that makes us ask a really fundamental question. When you pick up a story, are you looking for its final, big-picture message, or are you trying to be a detective and uncover the real historical facts behind it all?
Okay, so here's the puzzle. In the Old Testament, you've got two different prophetic books, Isaiah and Micah. Two totally different prophets. But get this, both books have this absolutely beautiful, world-changing prophecy about a future of total peace. You know, the one where nations beat their swords into plowshares. And what's so wild is that they are basically identical. We're talking word for word, the exact same vision.
So the obvious question, right, is who's quoting whom? Did Isaiah borrow from Micah? Did Micah lift it from Isaiah? Or maybe did they both pull from some older source that we just don't have anymore? It turns out the answer you lean towards, well, that reveals everything about how you approach a text. It literally unlocks two completely different ways of thinking about what truth even is.
Okay, let's dive into the first model. I want you to think of this as the director's cut approach, like with a movie. The idea here is that the final, polished version of the text, the one that was edited, compiled, and handed down for centuries, that's what really matters. That final product is the intended message, no matter how many different sources or editors had a hand in putting it together.
This way of reading is often called the canonical approach, and its main goal isn't to play detective and track down the original historical author. Nope. Instead, it's asking a different question. What's the big theological message of this book as a whole, in the exact form that the community of faith received it and decided to preserve it? You see, for this approach, the unity of the message is way more important than the specific identity of the messenger.
And what's really fascinating is that this is not some new, modern idea. Not at all. Pre-modern readers were incredibly sharp. I mean, they knew Moses couldn't have possibly written the parts of the Torah that describe his own death and burial, right? And they spotted these little clues, like passages that say, at that time, the Canaanite was in the land, which obviously suggests the writer is looking back from a time when the Canaanites were, well, not in the land anymore.
And this just perfectly illustrates the whole point. The scholar John Levinson puts it this way. He says, what is essential is not the authorship of the Torah, but its divinity and unity. You see, the claim that Moses was the author wasn't really a modern historical claim about who literally held the pen. It was a theological claim. It was a way of saying that these 5 books have a single, unified, divine authority, like they came from one mind, one source.
So let's bring this all the way back to our Isaiah and Micah puzzle. From this canonical viewpoint, asking who copied whom is just the wrong question. The answer isn't about plagiarism. It's about seeing this as a powerful sign of a single, unified, divine message. The reformer John Calvin had a great way of putting it. It's as if God is speaking through 2 different prophets with one mouth, just to hammer home the point that his word is unified.
Okay, so now let's pivot to our second model, because this one builds a completely different kind of picture. If the first model was the director's cut, think of this one as a cold case investigation. This approach isn't reading for the final theological message. Instead, it's treating the text like a file full of historical reports, and its job is to verify the facts behind the story.
This is what's known as the evidential approach. It looks at these texts as historical documents that are making claims about things that really happened. So the goal is to cross-examine those claims, test their reliability, figure out if they're based on credible eyewitness testimony. For this model, truth means it actually corresponds to historical reality.
Now, the central case study for this model is almost always the resurrection of Jesus. And the argument is built like a legal case, a series of clues. First, you've got this incredibly early creed, a short statement of faith that actually lists specific eyewitnesses. Then you have the Apostle Paul confirming that their testimony was the same as his. And finally, you have to account for the dramatic, almost unbelievable transformation of the disciples themselves.
Okay, and the evidence for this little creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is, well, it's pretty compelling. Scholars from all backgrounds, believers and non-believers, agree this isn't something Paul wrote himself. The phrasing is different. It has this poetic structure called parallelism, a long line followed by a short one, which was a classic memory trick for stuff passed down orally. Paul even says he received it. He didn't invent it. And the best part? Most scholars date this creed to within just a few years of the crucifixion. I mean, that's historical gold. It's a report from a time when all the alleged eyewitnesses were still around and could have easily said, nope, that's not what happened.
Another tool this approach uses is something called the principle of embarrassment. And it's pretty simple, really. Historians figure if you're just making up a story to make your movement look good, you're not going to invent details that make your heroes look, well, bad, right? But the Gospels are full of this stuff. The male disciples are portrayed as cowards, hiding in a locked room. Meanwhile, it's the women who are the brave first witnesses. And in that culture, a woman's testimony wasn't even considered legally reliable. That detail is so unhelpful if you're trying to invent a credible story that it actually makes it sound more historically true.
And then there's the whole naming of names thing. If you read the Gospels, most of the minor characters are just anonymous, a certain man or a ruler. But every now and then, a really obscure person who does one small thing gets a specific name, like Simon of Cyrene, the guy who carried the cross, or Cleopas on the road to Emmaus. So why name them? A really powerful theory is that these were the actual specific eyewitnesses who were the source for those particular stories in the early church community. Their names were kept because they were the ones who could say, yes, I was there, this happened.
So the crucial point here is this. The historical evidence is so strong that even highly skeptical scholars, like the agnostic historian Bart Ehrman, agree on the core historical fact. He says, and I'm quoting, "We can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples insisted that he soon appeared to them. This is a matter of public record." Now, people debate like crazy about what caused that belief, but the belief itself, the fact that they were absolutely convinced they saw the risen Jesus, that's considered a bedrock historical fact.
So what we have here are two really powerful but also really different ways of reading a text. And it's not really about one being right and the other being wrong. It's that they're asking totally different questions. They're searching for completely different kinds of truth.
Let's just break it down side by side. You've got the canonical approach, our director's cut, which is all about understanding the final theological message for the community. Here, the author is more of a symbol for the text's divine unity, and truth is about the coherence of the story itself. Then, you've got the evidential approach, our cold case investigation. Its goal is to verify the historical facts. The author is the original eyewitness source, and truth is all about whether the claims match up with what actually happened in history.
And all of this brings us right back to the central issue, doesn't it? As a reader, you're kind of standing at a crossroads. The lens you choose to look through is going to fundamentally shape everything you see, what you think is important, and the kind of meaning you ultimately find in these ancient, powerful texts.
To put it as simply as I can, one approach reads for the final story. It's about taking in the finished product as the intended message. The other approach reads behind the text, digging down through the layers to try and reconstruct the original events. So the question is, are you an art critic, admiring the final painting on the wall? Or are you an archaeologist, carefully excavating the ground beneath it?
And really, that's the big question, isn't it? Do we read for the story's final meaning, or do we read for the facts behind the story? Do these two ways of reading have to be enemies? Or maybe, could the richest understanding come from holding them both at the same time, appreciating the final masterpiece, while also respecting the historical foundation it's built on? The path you choose? Well, that determines not just how you read, but what kind of truth you're ultimately looking for.